somebody in the Facebook group gave the most awesome tip, I have to tell you. And she said, when you block something that has to be even, side by side, to do them on top of each other, because then you can pin them out to be exact. And when I pin something out, I look at the schematic, and for the sample I made, it's the smallest size. So for the armhole, it says from here to here, it should be 4 inches. And the sleeve from your first bind off to the top should be 4 inches. And so that is the first measurement that I pinned down right here, 4 inches. And then, for example, with the sleeve, I made kind of mini versions today, but here it says 9 inches across. Here it says 3 inches across. Those are also measurements that I would double check. So here I have, I blocked this before, and you'll notice I kept these stitches on the needle, and I'll go over that in a minute. So I steam, I don't wet block. Let me amend that. Before I put the garment together, I steam. And the reason I do that is because a lot of times on the edge, stockinette stitch will roll. And so I want to straighten that out. It'll just make everything so much easier. And then sometimes when I'm done, I will wet block. So there are a couple different ways to sew the shoulder seam. And the first one I'm going to show you, I tried to take this apart today, and it was so beautifully seamed by one of our sample knitters. I couldn't get it apart, but I can show you. I go under 1 full stitch, okay? And then I go to the other side of the shoulder, and I go under 1 full stitch. And now I go back to the first side, and where my yarn came out, I put my needle back in and go under the next stitch and go up here. Same thing. Where my needle came out, I put it back in, go under the next stitch. And I do this for 2 or 3 stitches, and then I pull tight. So I'm just going along right here. And then I pull it together tightly, and that will create a nice seam. So then I go like this, and it pulls up. And you can't even see the black. I see somebody, Elizabeth, you're really struggling to see. If you go onto my picture with my hands on it, on the upper right corner, you'll see a little blue box. If you click on that box and select pin, it will zoom this. Okay, cool. All right, so this is one way to do it. And I have seen patterns where they say to graft a seam here on the shoulder. And I disagree with that, because I think a shoulder seam has to be really strong, and especially in this design, because there's a set-in sleeve. And you want that sleeve, that armhole, to sit right on the body's armhole. So you can't have it stretching out. And I think that is what happens when you graft something. Okay, so that's the first way to seam.
Melissa, you have a couple of questions in the chat.
I block on gingham. Oh, so smart. And are you doing this on the wrong side? No, I am not. I'm doing this on the right side. Elizabeth, are you the one who's been sending questions? Okay, kudos to you, like Star Baker, because you have found some issues in the pattern, and we'll be sending out a pattern revision. And I just want to commend you, because you really have had a sharp eye. So thank you very much for your questions. And of course, anybody who has any question, please ask. All right, so yes, that was done on the right side. Now, this is called the 3 needle bind off. I have both my shoulder. This would be the front and the back on one side, okay? I put them together, wrong side together, okay? So this would be like sewing a seam. Again, I'm going to do this with black so that you can just really see what I'm doing. So I have 3 needles, hence the name, 3 needle bind off. And I'm going to go into the stitch on my front needle, into the stitch on the back needle, wrap my yarn around, and treat it. I pull it through as if they are now one. They are now one, but I treat them as if they're one. Okay, this is not a decrease because I'm not going from 2 stitches to 1 stitch on one place. I'm simply going the front needle and the back needle. I'm pulling the stitch through. Okay, so now I have 2 on my right needle and I'm binding off like I normally would. This creates a really neat seam on the inside. And I think it's also a strong seam. When I do this, I also make a point of going in the same direction for both shoulders. So for example, if I started on the armhole side on one side, I start on the armhole side of the other side. Is that clear? I was watching back through some of the videos and I realized sometimes it's hard to see. Okay, so I've gone through both. And now I'm going to show you what it looks like. This is what it looks like on the inside. See that nice little chain? And then on the outside, well, you do see it a little, but I think that the benefit is to have a nice strong seam. Okay, so other questions?
Melissa, what I like about the 3 needle bind off is like the stitches line up so beautifully, which it's
Yes.
hard to see on this tiny example, but it really is a beautiful finish.
And also, I just noticed, I can just kind of see that I have too many stitches on this side. I made some kind of mistake. All right, so I'm sure that I'm supposed to, my perfectionist is saying I should not do this. I should rip it back and make sure there's the same number of stitches on each needle. But really, I would just knit 2 together on one side. I think if you don't do that a bunch of times in the shoulder, it'll be fine. If you have to do it once, it's fine. So there is the 3 needle bind off. And this is wrong sides together. I'm not grafting and I'm not doing the mattress stitch. So this is wrong sides together.
Isn't it right sides together in the middle?
Wrong sides together. You mean the way it looks, or, oh, you mean the way I'm knitting it?
Well, it's like a sandwich with the right sides in the middle of the sandwich.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Oh, and then another point is I am doing this with the knit stitch. Even though I'm on the purl side, I'm knitting the stitches. Okay. Okay, Beth, great point. Just one, leave the yarn attached on a long tail. Don't cut the yarn for the 3 needle bind off. Yep. So then it's all right there and you don't have all this stuff going on. That's a good point. All right, so now I don't want to bias to everybody, but I got to tell you, Mattress Stitch is not my favorite thing at all. So Mattress Stitch is done with the right sides facing you. And again, you can leave a long tail. I'm just going to use the black yarn for purposes of demonstration. I like to leave a bit of a tail at the end, and I'll show you why. So I always do this one stitch in, and Tanya and I have had debates about this, but this is just the way I do this. I do it one stitch in, and it can be a little finicky with garter. So I go under one, and over here, I am going under one as well in order to match up those garter ridges. For some reason, this first one is just super finicky. Now I'm going to go under. If you pull your garter to open, you can see that there are two ladders. The space between the stitches look like ladders, and you can see there are two ladders there. So I go under the two ladders. I go over to where, just like before what we were doing, I go back in the same place I came out and go under two ladders. All right, I don't know why I still have my blocking mat here. I just keep catching myself on it. I'm a full stitch in. I go under both. And it's easier to see the ladders now. Out where I came in. Oh, I'm so sorry. And do you see that I'm going under two strands? Okay, there we go. Finally, we can see. And then I go in where I came out. And again, under two strands in between. And I continue this way all the way up. And every once in a while, I mean, not once in a while, like every 3 or 4 stitches, I'll pull it tightly. And once again, there's a sweet spot. You don't want to pull it too tightly. You don't want to keep it too loose. And I'm going to go up this whole area so that I'll have a completed sleeve to work with. Because this area up here is going to be hidden in the seam for the sleeve, I'm not going to worry too much about how it looks. I'm just going to go back and forth like this. And I will bury. I turned it to the inside. And I'm just going to weave this in and out. One of the things I do when I bury my yarns is I make a U-turn. And I go this way so that if someone tugs on it, which kids are prone to do, it's locked. I consider that locked. Now, back down here, I took a class at Stitches West, back when there was a Stitches West. And Leslie Solomon gave this tip. And she said, when you're doing the bottom down here, to close up that little divot, you do a figure 8. And what that does is it builds yarn up right here at the edge so that you don't have You know, sometimes your seam will have that little V in it. And if you build it up like this, it won't have that. So there's that. Now, I'm going to quickly finish this seam because I want to show you how to, some tricks with setting in the sleeve. And I have to tell you, whether it is sewing or knitting, not my favorite thing to set in a sleeve, but I mean, what a beautiful sleeve, right? So it's worth it. Okay, so here I have my armhole. And here I have my sleeve. And because I measured this, they're the same size. All right. I'm going to use little coilless safety pins. And you can get these on Amazon, but you can also get them at a knitting store. And the advantage is your yarn won't get caught in the coil. So these are coilless. And I'm going to start pinning the seam to the middle of the bind off. I'm going to pin the middle of the sleeve cap to the armhole or to the shoulder seam. And then I'm just going to work, just kind of eyeball the middle. And if I have a really long shoulder seam, armhole seam, I might do more than one or two pins. And here we go. Once again, mattress stitch. One of our sample knitters gave me this tip this last week, and that is to start in the middle of your sleeve like this. And I'm going to go under one stitch over here. I'm going to leave a nice long tail so that I can use this same strand for the other side and go into one stitch in and start going back and forth like that. So again, I'm going back into the stitch I came out of, same over here. So we have a flat space right here with a rounded edge over here. Now, honestly, normally I would wing it, but I recognize that's not a very good teaching tool. So one of the things you can do is, again, using safety pins, is use your eye and kind of round this out. And I'm going to go down 2 stitches here. And over here, I'm going to do another one where I'm just rounding out that tip. So now I'm going to go down. And again, there's another one where I'm kind of going off the beaten path, but I'm rounding out that corner because you don't want a corner on your sleeve. Again, one stitch in, down where I came up. And because we did that fully fashioning, there's almost like a path for you. As you go along. Tanya, are there any questions?
No questions coming in. It's funny watching you. I feel my anxiety because I have such anxiety about finishing, and I don't know if other people do too. But it's like I'm watching you and I'm like holding my breath a little bit. So I'm finding this really helpful. And I know when I sew my sleeves on, I'm gonna just press stop and watch each little thing and as I go, because this is, as you know, from knowing me personally, this is the hard part for me. Anyone have questions as we're going?
I have a question.
Yes.
When you started,
Mhm.
you were sewing something to something. Then you did the shoulder seam. No, before that, right at the beginning, you were sewing something before the shoulder and then the sides, and this is the sleeves. But you started with something before the 3-needle bind off. What was that you were sewing
That was
together?
also the shoulder seam. And I was basically doing the mattress stitch.
Right.
Yeah,
And you were just doing the shoulder seam and then you did it again with the 3-needle?
correct. I showed you two
Okay,
different ways. Yeah.
okay, I see.
It was confusing because I couldn't get my sample undone. So I was
Okay,
showing you the shoulder seam over the
two
shoulder.
different ways, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm getting down here. And this is where I bound off 3 stitches. And this is where I bound off 3 stitches. So I mean, it's not a firm, fast rule, but I do want to try and line that up because that will create a nice, your sleeve will sit nicely. And I don't know if you guys can see this, but there's a little bit of a bubble here. And so when I go over here, I'm just going to go under 3 strands instead of 2 and just ease that in. Here's my bind off. I'm going to go underneath that. And here's the needle at the bottom. And this is where I will stop and go back up to the top and do the other side. It was pointed out to me that this just makes it look really neat. And also you're able to control the way the sleeve is fitting into the armhole much better. So there we go. I have a list here, shoulder, sleeve. Okay, so any questions so far? No. Okay, so buttons, 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 buttons. All right, I pulled out all of my blue yarn, you may remember from last week, which just kind of created a mess. And you would attach the armholes after the crochet trim. You'd have your loops over here, and you would just line your buttons. You would put your pins right in the middle of your buttonhole, and I like to position it 1 stitch in. And this is just for strength. I think that doing half a stitch is going to create maybe a pull when you do it. So I have a nice big white button. And also I have, I don't know if this is an extra, I don't know where you guys get these, but maybe it's on the inside, an extra button on the shirt or something. But this is just one of those little buttons, a reinforcement button. I have knotted my yarn. Okay. So I don't even go through the button yet. To secure my yarn, I come up, I go back down over 1 strand, and in the back, I get my yarn, my thread to open up, and I go through like this. because trying to get a knot to stay in your yarn is almost impossible. So I'm just securing that like that. Now, come up. I go down. And this is where I'm going to secure the button in the back. And the reason I do this is because you're really only attaching your button to one stitch. And especially with kids, you know, they can really pull on a garment. And so I just want to give some reinforcement in the back. And I'll do this 2 or 3 times. And then try and take the garment off my children instead of them ripping it off. But this just creates a little bit of reinforcement in the back. Okay, are you using yarn or a thread of a different kind? I chose to use thread just for the demonstration so you could see it, but you could easily use your yarn. And if you need to pull apart the plies so that you have a smaller thread, you know, if your yarn's big and it won't go through the buttonhole, you could do that. And that's my tip for the buttons. I made a really pretty garment for a friend's baby, and it had huge daisy buttons on the front. I mean, it was a baby. She was just going to lay there, as a disclaimer. And what I did is, instead of creating buttonholes, I attached the button to the front and I used snaps. So I put a snap on the back and a snap on the front, because there was just no way. I mean, it was like that big. It was really cute. And there was just no way that was going to be able to go through the buttonhole. And if there was a buttonhole, it would have been so distorted. So that's what I did there. And I have one more tip that actually is a Stephen West tip. And when he buries his yarn, he gives it a pretty long tail. He doesn't do a U-turn like I do. So he leaves a long tail, and then he blocks it, and then he kind of, you know, massages it and everything so that this will work its way wherever it's going to work itself, and then you can clip it. Because I see this sometimes where a tail will come to the front. You know, it'll kind of work its way out and it'll be in the front. Actually, whenever I make shawls, I'll put them on and there will be a little tail sticking out. So that's a Stephen West tip. Okay, do you think it's strong enough to just use thread? This is polyester thread that I'm using, and I doubled it. So I do think that that is strong enough. Cotton thread is kind of iffy, I think. Anything else?
You have another question there. Would you also use reinforcement button if you are using a shank button?
Good question.
What is a shank? What is a shank button?
Let's say here's your button, right? And then it's got that down here. And this is where you attach it to your garment. Do you know what I mean? This is the button. And then there's usually like a little loop at the bottom. That's a really good question. I would fiddle around with it a little. And I also might, when I attach it to the sweater, might try and go around more than one stitch. It's that attaching the button to just one thread of your sweater that is the issue. Do you see what I mean right there? If that's all you attach it to, it's going to pull. All right. I think that's it. I'm checking my list. That's it. I just really encourage you to enjoy. I do. Um, and it's a labor of love, you know? This is for your enjoyment. Okay, back